beneath Stormveil Castle, where the roots of ancient trees pierce through crumbling stone like grasping fingers, there exists a sight that defies comprehension. Down here, in the suffocating darkness where even torchlight seems reluctant to spread, the walls themselves have begun to change. What appears at first to be merely peculiar root formations reveals itself as something far more disturbing upon closer inspection. The bark splits and peels away in places, exposing what shouldn't exist. Flesh that pulses with a terrible vitality, scales that shimmer with an aquatic sheen, and most horrifying of all, a face. Not just any face, but one bearing features of impossible beauty, corrupted into something that makes even hardened, tarnished warriors step back in revulsion. Welcome, lore seekers, to another deep dive with Keen 7 Lore, where today we descend into one of Elden Ring's most disturbing mysteries, the spreading corruption of Godwyn the Golden's corpse and the Deathroot plague that followed his assassination. What you're witnessing through Rogia's eyes in those depths isn't merely a single aberration. It's part of something far more widespread, far more insidious. For Godwyn's death created something unprecedented in the lands between. A corpse that refuses to remain singular, a body that spreads like a disease through the very roots of the world, manifesting in places separated by vast distances, yet connected by threads of corruption running beneath the earth. Picture, if you will, the horror of discovering that what you thought was a single tragedy has metastasized into something that touches every corner of the realm. Imagine finding the same twisted visage staring back at you from cathedral depths, from forgotten catacombs, from places where no corpse should logically exist. This is the reality that adventurers face when they encounter Godwyn's husks. Not mere copies or illusions, but actual manifestations of his ever-growing, ever-spreading flesh. The question that haunts every scholar who studies this phenomenon is deceptively simple, yet profoundly disturbing. How does one corpse become many? How does a single body, no matter how divine its origins, spread across an entire continent? The answer lies not in simple decay or corruption, but in something far more fundamental, a breaking of the very rules that govern life and death in the lands between. When Godwyn died, or rather, when he was murdered in that carefully orchestrated ritual known as the Night of Black Knives, something went catastrophically wrong. Or perhaps, depending on your perspective, catastrophically right. The assassination that changed everything didn't happen in some grand battlefield or throne room, but in the supposed safety of Leyndell itself, during what should have been an ordinary evening in the Golden Capital. The Black Knife assassins, wielding blades imbued with the power of destined death itself, struck with surgical precision. These weren't random killings, but coordinated strikes designed to achieve something specific: the death of demigods who were thought to be beyond mortality's reach. Godwyn, firstborn son of Queen Marika and the legendary Godfrey, became their primary victim, though we now know the attack claimed others as well. If you're enjoying this deep dive so far, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. It makes a real difference in helping this video reach fellow lore enthusiasts through YouTube's algorithm. Your support means everything and helps keep these in-depth explorations coming. The ritual blade that pierced Godwyn carried a fragment of the Rune of Death, stolen from Malekith during a moment of unprecedented vulnerability. But here's where the tragedy transforms into cosmic horror. The assassin's blade carried only half of a curse mark, a twisted hallow mark that would normally kill both body and soul together. Through circumstances that remain debated among scholars, Godwyn received only the half that killed his soul, while elsewhere, Lunar Princess Ranni received the half that destroyed her body. This splitting of what should have been a single, complete death created two abominations. Ranni, a soul without flesh who would pursue her own dark agenda, and Godwyn, flesh without soul that would become something far worse than merely dead. Consider for a moment what this means. Every living being, from the lowest beast to the mightiest demigod, exists as a union of corporeal form and spiritual essence. When death comes naturally, or even unnaturally through violence, both elements cease together. The body decays, the soul departs, and the cycle continues as it has since time immemorial. But Godwyn's flesh, divorced from its animating spirit, yet still somehow vital, entered a state that had never before existed in the lands between. His body didn't simply die. It transformed, mutated, grew in ways that defied every natural law. The immediate aftermath of the assassination saw Godwyn's body treated with the reverence befitting a fallen prince. Despite the unprecedented nature of his death, or perhaps because of it, those who loved him attempted to grant him the highest honor available in the Golden Order, burial at the roots of the Erd Tree itself. Deep beneath the capital, where the Erd Tree's roots intertwine with the ancient root system of the Great Tree that preceded it, they laid Godwyn to rest. This act, meant as a final mercy, would prove to be the catalyst for a plague unlike anything the lands between had witnessed. If you're finding value in this exploration so far, consider subscribing to support the channel and join our growing community of lore enthusiasts. Your support truly makes these deep investigations possible. The transformation that overtook Godwyn's corpse defies easy description, though those who've witnessed it firsthand often speak in hushed tones of aquatic horror merged with divine decay. Where once stood a golden prince of legendary beauty, there now writhes something that seems pulled from the depths of primordial oceans. His lower body has elongated into a massive tail, covered in scales that shimmer with an oily iridescence, reminiscent of deep-sea creatures that never see sunlight. The musculature has twisted into configurations that suggest swimming motions, though this corpse will never again move under its own power. The upper body maintains a grotesque parody of human form, though stretched and distorted beyond natural proportions. The arms have developed webbing between elongated fingers, and the skin has taken on a mottled, amphibian quality that weeps a constant film of moisture. But it's the face that proves most disturbing to witnesses, not because it has decayed beyond recognition, but because it hasn't. Godwyn's features remain perfectly preserved in their moment of death, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, eyes forever open yet seeing nothing, mouth slightly agape as if frozen mid-breath. This aquatic transformation connects to something deeper in the mythology of the lands between. Community scholars have drawn compelling parallels to the Ningyo of ancient legend, creatures whose consumption granted immortality at a terrible price. The basilisks that haunt the depths of various catacombs share these same aquatic features, their bulbous false eyes and fish-like characteristics, marking them as creatures touched by the same force that transformed Godwyn. These beings spread deathblight wherever they go, their very presence a vector for the corruption that emanates from the Prince of Death. The positioning of Godwyn's primary corpse in Deathroot depths tells its own story of transformation. His body hasn't simply been placed there. It has become part of the architecture itself, fused with the root system in ways that blur the line between flesh and flora. The pose he maintains, arms spread wide with his head tilted back, suggests either agony or ecstasy, perhaps both. Mushrooms and fungal growth sprout from his flesh, not as decay, but as new forms of life that shouldn't exist, fed by the deathroot that pulses through his remains. Understanding how Godwyn's corpse spreads requires examining the vast root network that exists beneath the lands between. Long before the Erd tree dominated the landscape, there existed the Great Tree, whose roots spread throughout the underground regions. When the Erd tree grew, it didn't replace this system, but rather grew atop it, its own roots intertwining with those ancient passages. The deep-root depths, where Godwyn's primary corpse resides, represents a nexus point where multiple root systems converge: Erd tree roots from above, Great Tree roots from the ancient past, and the corrupted Deathroot that now spreads from Godwyn's remains. The burial at these roots created an unprecedented situation. The Erd tree, which normally processes death and rebirth according to the Golden Order's design, encountered something it couldn't properly digest: a death that wasn't truly dead. Godwyn's soulless flesh began spreading through the root system like an infection, but not in the way disease typically spreads. Instead of destroying what it touched, it transformed it, creating new growths that bore his characteristics. The roots themselves began to take on qualities of flesh, pulsing with unnatural life. This corruption doesn't spread randomly but follows the paths of the root systems themselves. Where roots have been severed or blocked, the spread stops. Where they remain connected, even across vast distances, Godwyn's influence seeps through. The Deathroot that emerges in various locations across the lands. Between represents points where this corrupted root system breaks through to the surface, each emergence carrying with it a piece of Godwyn's essence. The phenomenon becomes even more disturbing when we examine how this corruption interacts with the golden sap that once flowed through these roots. Confirmed canon tells us that the Erd tree's roots once carried golden vitality throughout the land, nourishing life according to Marika's design. Now, those same channels carry something else entirely: a black corruption that transforms life into undeath, creating beings that exist outside the normal cycle of death and rebirth. The cartography of Godwyn's manifestations across the lands between reveals a pattern that speaks to the systematic nature of his spread. The major corpse manifestations, those grotesque duplicates found in the Fog Rift Catacombs, the Scorpion River Catacombs, and beneath Stormveil Castle, don't appear randomly but emerge at specific convergence points in the root network. Each represents a place where the corruption has grown strong enough to manifest a full surrogate corpse, complete with the same aquatic mutations and preserved death mask face. The Fog Rift Catacombs manifestation proves particularly fascinating. Here, Godwyn's corpse surrogate has grown to such size that it dominates the entire lower chamber, its presence transforming the very air into something that induces death blight in those who linger too long. The roots here haven't simply been corrupted. They've been replaced entirely by flesh that maintains the shape and function of roots while being fundamentally something else. Those who've examined it closely report that the flesh pulses with a rhythm that matches no heartbeat, a slow undulation that suggests tidal movements despite being nowhere near any ocean. At Stormveil Castle, Roger's discovery beneath the fortress reveals another aspect of these manifestations. Here, Godwyn's face emerges from what appears to be a massive pustule or cyst in the root system, the features perfectly preserved yet horrifically out of place. The surrounding area shows signs of ongoing transformation, stone becoming slightly organic, roots developing characteristics of nervous tissue, and most disturbing of all, the appearance of eyes in places where no eyes should exist. The minor manifestations scattered throughout the lands between tell their own disturbing story. In locations like Summonwater Village, Tombsward Catacombs, and the ruins near Wyndham, investigators have documented something truly unsettling: Godwyn's eyes appearing on previously normal objects. These aren't painted or carved representations but actual organic eyes that seem to grow from whatever surface they appear upon. A piece of driftwood develops an eye. A stone suddenly sprouts ocular tissue. Even the shells of certain crabs have been documented, bearing Godwyn's distinctive gaze. These eyes don't merely appear as grotesque decorations. Evidence suggests they serve as some form of sensory network, though what they perceive and where that information goes remains a mystery. Some scholars theorize they allow Godwyn's corpse to see through the Deathroot network, though what consciousness could exist in soulless flesh to process such sight remains unknown. Others believe the eyes represent points where the boundary between Godwyn's death and the living world has grown particularly thin. The 9 confirmed Deathroot locations across the lands between form their own network of corruption. Each represents a place where Godwyn's influence has broken through to the surface with sufficient strength to create the twisted root formations that Gurranq, the beast clergyman, so desperately seeks to consume. These locations, from the death-touched catacombs to the Black Knife catacombs, share certain characteristics: proximity to the underground root network, presence of those who live in death, and environmental changes that suggest reality itself has been altered by Godwyn's presence. The creation of those who live in death represents perhaps the most tragic consequence of Godwyn's corruption. These beings didn't choose their condition. They simply had the misfortune of dying in areas where Deathroot had spread. Instead of passing on according to the Golden Order's design, their spirits became trapped in their deceased flesh, animated by the same force that keeps Godwyn's corpse in its state of living death. They rise as skeletons, as spirits, as various forms of undead that shouldn't exist in a world where the Erd Tree governs the cycle of death and rebirth. The skeletal warriors that adventurers encounter throughout the lands. Between display an unsettling intelligence. They don't merely attack mindlessly but show tactics, coordination, and most disturbing of all, the ability to resurrect themselves unless their connection to Deathroot is severed. Watch carefully when you strike one down. The bones don't simply collapse but begin to reassemble, drawing back together with invisible threads until the warrior rises again. Only by destroying the glowing component that appears, the concentrated Deathroot essence, can they be permanently defeated. These undead have developed their own culture, their own hierarchies, and most remarkably, their own form of worship. In the depths where they gather, investigators have found shrines decorated with Godwyn's image, offerings left before crude representations of his transformed state. They call him the Prince of Death, and in their mindless way, they venerate him as a deity of their unwanted condition. The Tibia mariners, those ghostly boatmen who ferry the souls of those who live in death, bear special significance as they seem to serve as priests or shepherds of this accidental religion. The Golden Order's response to those who live in death has been swift and merciless. Dee and his fellow hunters travel the lands between with a single purpose: to destroy these abominations wherever they're found. From the Golden Order's perspective, those who live in death represent a fundamental violation of the natural order, beings that exist outside Marika's design and therefore must be eliminated. Dee's armor bears inscriptions that speak of this sacred duty, this obligation to correct what Godwyn's corruption has made wrong. Yet there's a tragedy in this persecution that even Dee acknowledges in his quieter moments. Those who live in death didn't choose their fate. They're victims of Godwyn's corruption, just as much as Godwyn himself was a victim of assassination. The skeletal warriors who attacked travelers might have been loyal soldiers in life. The spirits that haunt graveyards might have been loving families. Now they exist in a state of perpetual undeath, unable to truly die, yet unable to truly live, hunting the living, perhaps out of instinct, perhaps out of envy, or perhaps simply because that's what the Deathroot commands. The environmental storytelling surrounding Godwyn's manifestations creates an atmosphere of creeping dread that pervades every location touched by his corruption. Visual horror permeates these spaces. Walls develop organic cysts that pulse with internal pressure. Floors become covered in a film that might be moisture, or might be something worse. And the air itself takes on a thickness that makes breathing feel like drowning. These changes don't happen suddenly, but gradually, each day bringing subtle alterations that accumulate into transformation. In areas of heavy corruption, investigators have documented phenomena that defy conventional understanding. Stone surfaces develop what can only be described as acne, raised bumps that eventually burst to reveal eyes, teeth, or patches of scale. Water sources become contaminated not with typical pollution, but with something that makes the water move wrong, flowing in patterns that suggest consciousness rather than gravity. Even the sounds change. The normal ambient noise of dungeons and catacombs replaced by something that might be breathing, might be tide movements, or might be something without any natural equivalent. The death blight that emanates from these corrupted zones represents a unique form of supernatural contamination. Unlike poison that attacks the body or madness that attacks the mind, death blight targets the very connection between body and soul. Those exposed to concentrated death blight experience a building sensation of disconnection, as if their spirit is being forcibly separated from their flesh. If exposure continues, the result is instant death, not through physical trauma, but through the severing of whatever force binds life together. The crab creatures found in certain regions demonstrate another disturbing aspect of Godwyn's spread. These normally mundane creatures have developed grotesque modifications in areas where Deathroot has emerged. Their shells bear Godwyn's face, perfectly formed, despite the impossible anatomy required. These aren't mere surface decorations. The face appears to be functional, capable of expression and movement independent of the crab itself. Whether the crab remains in control or whether Godwyn's presence has overwritten their simple consciousness remains a matter of debate among scholars. The attempts to cure or control Godwyn's condition read like a catalogue of failure, each more tragic than the last. Miquella, brilliant prodigy and beloved brother, devoted considerable effort to finding a solution. The Eclipse ritual he attempted at Castle Sol represented his most ambitious effort, an attempt to restore Godwyn's soul through celestial intervention. The frozen battlefield surrounding Castle Sol tells the story of this failure. The Eclipse was summoned, but couldn't complete its purpose. Godwyn's body, it seems, had transformed too much to accept a soul's return, or perhaps the soul itself had travelled too far beyond recovery. Fortissax's story carries its own particular tragedy. This ancient dragon, friend and companion to Godwyn in life, entered the prince's corrupted body in a desperate attempt to fight the death spreading within. Imagine the courage required. A dragon of lightning and storm willingly entering a corpse to battle corruption from within. But instead of victory, Fortissax found only contamination. The death that lived in Godwyn proved contagious, even to dragons. Now Fortissax exists as the Lichdragon, a corrupted shadow of its former glory, still fighting a battle that was lost before it began. Fia's approach took a different direction entirely. Rather than trying to restore Godwyn to true life, she sought to grant him a different form of existence, to complete his transformation into the Prince of Death properly. Her ritual at the base of Godwyn's corpse in Deathroot depths wasn't about resurrection, but about apotheosis, transforming Godwyn from an accidental source of undeath into a proper deity of those who live in death. The fact that this ritual requires the murder of D and the gestation of the mending rune of death speaks to the fundamental changes Fia sought to make to the order of the world itself. The wandering mausoleums represent perhaps the most poignant attempts to address Godwyn's condition. These massive stone constructs carry the bodies of soulless demigods, Godwyn's spiritual siblings in a sense, though their conditions arose through different circumstances. They wander endlessly, their bells tolling in what some interpret as an attempt to call back the souls of those within. The fact that they cannot duplicate remembrances of Godwyn, despite their ability to replicate those of other demigods, suggests something fundamentally different about his death, a severance so complete that even these powerful constructs cannot bridge it. The corruption spreading from Godwyn exists as more than mere physical contamination. It represents a fundamental breakdown in the metaphysical laws governing the lands between. The Golden Order, established by Queen Marika to create a world without destined death, never accounted for the possibility of death without death, flesh that continues without spirit, existence without essence. Godwyn's condition created a paradox that the Order's rigid structure couldn't process or contain. Consider the philosophical implications of Godwyn's state. In a world where death was removed from the natural order, his assassination reintroduced it in the worst possible way. Not clean death that allows for rebirth and renewal, but corrupted death that spreads like a disease. Every manifestation of his corpse, every emergence of Deathroot, every rising of those who live in death, represents a further degradation of Marika's perfect system. The Golden Order sought to create eternal life, but Godwyn's corruption created eternal undeath, a mockery of the intended paradise. The permanence of this corruption cannot be overstated. Even if someone could somehow destroy every manifestation, consume every piece of Deathroot, eliminate every one of those who live in death, the source would remain. Godwyn's primary corpse in Deeproot depths has become too integrated with the fundamental structure of the lands between to simply remove. It has become a feature of the landscape itself, as permanent as mountains or rivers. The roots that spread his corruption have grown too vast, too interconnected to sever without destroying the very foundation of the world above. This permanence extends to the theological implications of Godwyn's transformation. In becoming the Prince of Death, willingly or not, he has created a new constant in a world that tried to eliminate such constants. Death, removed by Marika's will, has returned through Godwyn's corrupted flesh in a form that proves impossible to remove again. The very existence of those who live in death proves that the Golden Order's vision of controlled life and death has failed. The system has been compromised at its most fundamental level. The tragedy of Godwyn extends beyond his own suffering to encompass everyone touched by his corruption. Rogier, who discovered the horror beneath Stormveil, would eventually succumb to death blight himself, his body, gradually losing its connection to life despite all attempts at treatment. The nameless soldiers who rise as skeletons had their eternal rest stolen by proximity to Deathroot. Even the lands themselves suffer, areas of beauty transformed into zones of horror by the spreading contamination. Yet perhaps the greatest tragedy lies in what Godwyn represented before his death. As the firstborn of Marika and Godfrey, he embodied the golden age of the lands between. His victories in battle, particularly his friendship with the dragon Fortissax, showed that even ancient enemies could be reconciled. He was, by all accounts, truly golden, noble, powerful, and beloved. His death didn't just remove a great hero from the world. It transformed that hero into an endless source of corruption. The spreading of Godwyn's corpse husks throughout the lands between stands as a testament to the unintended consequences of attempting to control fundamental forces. Marika sought to remove death, but in doing so, created the conditions for a far worse fate. The assassins sought to kill a god, but instead created something that transcends normal classification. Every attempt to fix or mitigate the situation has only spread the corruption further or transformed it into new forms of horror. As we stand in these corrupted depths, witnessing faces that shouldn't exist, staring from walls that were once simple stone, we're forced to confront the reality of Godwyn's legacy. This isn't a mystery that can be solved or a problem that can be fixed. It's a new reality that the lands between must accept, a world where death lives, where corpses spread like disease, and where the Golden Prince has become an endless font of corruption. The investigation into Godwyn's corpse husks reveals more than just a supernatural phenomenon. It exposes the fundamental fragility of any system that attempts to deny natural law. Death, removed from the world, returned in a form far more terrible than simple mortality. The Golden Order, in its hubris, created the conditions for its own corruption. And Godwyn, innocent victim of assassination, became the unwitting architect of a plague that will persist as long as the lands between themselves endure. Thank you, fellow law-seekers, for joining me on this journey through one of Elden Ring's darkest mysteries. The story of Godwyn's transformation from Golden Prince to source of endless corruption reminds us that in the lands between, even death itself can die, and what remains might be worse than any ending. If this deep dive into the spreading horror of Deathroot has enriched your understanding of Elden Ring's intricate world, please consider subscribing to support more investigations into gaming's most fascinating mysteries. Your engagement helps these explorations reach fellow enthusiasts who share our passion for uncovering the hidden truths buried within our favorite games. Until next time, remember that in the lands between, some corpses refuse to remain singular, and some deaths echo forever through the roots of the world. This has been Keen 7 Lore, and I'll see you in the next investigation into gaming's deepest mysteries.